This is Progress Canada. Today I'm joined by Deb Matthews, former Deputy Premier of Ontario and longtime advocate for income security. In government, she helped create the Ontario Child Benefit, planted the seeds for Ontario's basic income pilot, and introduced Ontario's very first poverty reduction strategy. Today we'll discuss how these and other policy solutions can help create a reliable economic floor in society. Thanks for joining me, Deb.
I'm happy to be with you.
So you played a pretty key role in creating the Ontario Child Benefit, which was, a permanent program that helps simplify and strengthen financial supports for low-income families. Can you talk about what inspired the creation of that program and how you got it off the ground?
Yeah, this is actually a good story. It's a good story about how politics can make lives better for people. So I was elected in 2003. And in that election, it was a terrific election. We had a whole bunch of new, very progressive activist members who were new to politics who had run because they didn't want the continuation of the Harris-Eves philosophy.
Right.
We were pretty passionate, and we decided to form a women's caucus. So we
I forgot that was the genesis of
it
it.
started, exactly. So the first thing we wanted, we decided that we wanted to do one issue at a time. We wanted to really do the research and get our ducks in a row. And the first issue we went with was Sharia law. And that's a different conversation, but we successfully managed that. And then the next issue we wanted to focus on was poverty. And when you go knocking door to door, you actually see poverty the way it really is. Not, it's an eye opener for a lot of people to actually knock on the doors of people who are living in real poverty and hearing some stories. And so the women decide, okay, let's make poverty our next challenge. And we had not run on this. This was something that was new. And we were advised to focus on child poverty first because it was felt that you could achieve real success there, demonstrable success, and that it was more manageable. So the Women and Women's Caucus put together a plan that included the Ontario Child Benefit, and then we took it to full caucus. And lots of the men stood up and said, yes, 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 this is what we need to be doing. We're fully supportive
That's what you want to hear.
Yeah. And Dalton McGuinty decided that we would include this. And so Greg Sober's budget actually included a new Ontario Child Benefit, which is real cash in the hands of people. I remember when I was out consulting on the poverty reduction strategy, I was with Lou Rinaldi in his riding in Eastern Ontario. And there was a woman there, and she said, Deb, you need to understand one thing. People are poor because they don't have enough money. We don't need new programs. We need cash. And that really stuck with me because, you can try to come up with a lot of little programs, but really, people need more money in their pocket. So I think it's, I don't know what it is now, but it was $110 per month per child, and made a real difference. For people with lots of money, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but I used to think of it as groceries delivered to the front porch every month. It makes a real difference for people who are struggling to make ends meet.
Well, I think about that a lot in the context of where we are today in society and how people are really struggling again with groceries, shelter, etc. And it sounds silly to say people just need money, but like that is essentially what they need. And when you think about different income levels, the amount of disposable income you have for really basic needs, there's a huge gap depending on how big your salary is. Like at a certain point, if your salary is too small, like all your money is going to those things. So to your point, at that point, you just need more money. How early in the mandate was this?
It was very early in the mandate. It was, yeah, I'm not sure exactly but it was our first or second budget, I think.
Okay, so first term. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, first term for sure.
So then we fast forward about 10 years and we get to the point where we have a new premier now. It's Premier Kathleen Wynne. You two were obviously very close, partly because of Women's Caucus all those years back in time, but also just I think you obviously had a good personal relationship and had a lot in common in terms of viewpoints on how things should go.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So after the 2014 election, we won, of course. We got a majority government, and the premier then tapped you. This is, of course, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. People were really struggling. It's the biggest economic upheaval to that point since the Great Depression. We have seen other things since then. But the premier tapped you to be the president of the Treasury Board,
Yeah.
but also the minister responsible for Ontario's poverty reduction strategy. So she asked you to find ways to sort of curb government spending, but then also find ways to reduce poverty. So how did you tackle these, seemingly competing demands?
Yeah. So just to be clear, Dalton McGuinty appointed me Minister of Poverty, responsible for poverty reduction too. He was, when I was first appointed Minister of Children and Youth Services, it included or added on the poverty reduction minister. And one of the things we did is we introduced legislation requiring a new poverty reduction strategy every 5 years. So,
Right.
so president of the Treasury Board, save money, and poverty reduction strategy, find ways to support people with low income. So one of the big accomplishments that, of course, Ford has partially undone were changes to OSAP, Ontario Student Assistance Program, where and you'll remember this, we really streamlined the process. We canceled tax credits that went disproportionately to the wealthiest people and moved that all into upfront grants for the lowest income. We got fantastic results in the first year. 35% increase in the number of Indigenous students, 35% increase in the number of single moms applying for OSAP, which, like, beyond our wildest dreams. It was highly successful, but unfortunately, the Auditor General made an erroneous report. She didn't have her facts straight, and a lot of the good was undone, unfortunately. But I think everyone agrees that an education is a really good foundation for a poverty reduction strategy. So whether it's preschool kids, or whether it's going on to post-secondary, a good education is a good poverty reduction strategy.
Well, and you mentioned OSAP, and again, that was another direct transfer of money to families.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the single mothers who went back to school, that changes the trajectory of that entire family after
Exactly.
that point, right?
It is not just the mom going back to school, it is her kids. No question about it.
So when you were doing these two, seemingly competing roles, it wasn't, go gut some programs. It was go find how to use money better. And part of the way we budget in Ontario, in any government really, is we don't really go back to zero. We start based on what we did last year or the years before and sort of build out from there, which means you can get some programs that no longer do what they were intended to do, 10, 15 years before. Can you talk a little bit about that? This PRRT, I never remember what any of the letters stand for, but this program, renewal something transformation.
Renewal and transformation.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was quite a process, but it was really important to look across government. Not traditionally, you just look at the incremental spending. What new are you adding this year? Everything else stays the same. Whether or not they're getting the results you were hopeful they would. In fact, much of what happens in government, nobody even knows what they're trying to achieve, how you measure success, which was astonishing to me that we didn't actually keep track of that sort of thing, because I was all about putting more money into the things that work and stop doing things that don't have that impact. So
It
So
seems
the
logical.
first step was to do this inventory of programs across all ministries and try to sort them into what outcomes they were looking for. The idea was that we would then group them together and say, if you have this much money to spend, it's not more money, but it's all the money, put into one pot. How would we spend that money to achieve that income, or that outcome rather? So, I mean, that we were well into that process. I would have loved to have had another 5 years to fully implement it. But one of the things we did do was we set up a center for evidence-based decision making, where we actually started to train people within the ministries how to develop your KPIs, your key performance indicators. How do you measure success? And that was part of the process. I'm not sure what happened after I left, but I don't think it's good.
Well, there's two things that I find really interesting out about it. One is this was not a Doge thing. Like you weren't just slashing
No,
and burning and going in there and cutting things without knowing what anything did. But the second part was what you were just talking about was the data-driven side of it, the what is actually effective here. And so you were talking about the poverty reduction strategy, which of course you started as a minister and eventually got re-inherited back later on in the process. And to your point, it's a 5-year strategy, so it comes up every now and again. And by the time you had gotten it again as a minister, and then when it was handed off by you to Minister Ballard, who I'd also worked for and got to work on with this, you had created the Local Poverty Reduction Fund, which essentially put this into practice. It was saying what is actually working around the province in terms of reducing poverty and how can we better fund it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah. So yeah, we set up this local poverty reduction fund because I became convinced, and the more I traveled across the province and spoke to people in communities, they knew what needed to happen in their communities. They knew their communities well. And so we invited communities to apply for this money. And it came with a very clear, you must measure your performance. We want to know what works and what doesn't work. You have to be prepared to share your data, so that we were sort of building up this base of knowledge on what actually did work. I was inspired by the Washington State Institute for Public Policies. I've gotten that a bit wrong, but it's in Washington State, and they actually do cost benefit analysis of various programs. They don't do new new programs, but the Washington State government turns to them and says, we want some ideas of what works in reducing recidivism and incarcerated youth. What can we do on that? And then they review everything that's in that, trying to achieve that outcome, and they do a cost benefit. It's a fascinating thing to check out. I was really inspired by that because you can see that different programs have very, very different return on investment. And some of them have no return on investment. Some of them have a significant return on investment. So let's put our money where it will actually drive change.
So that actually brings up an interesting point about looking towards other jurisdictions for success stories and then, adapting them for where you are. So, a lot of people credit the Ontario Child Benefit with inspiring the Canadian Child Benefit.
Yeah.
It cribbed the name, so I think it probably did inspire it. So that came in 2016, of course, when the federal Liberal government was first elected. And then, within 4 years of that program coming in at the federal level, it was estimated to have cut child poverty in half, which is an incredible number. A little bit as that gone up, post-COVID when CERB and other things have disappeared, but that was an enormous impact on child poverty in this country. Then the federal government also copied Ontario in creating the first ever national poverty reduction strategy. And I think that one was also tied to legislation and had a 5-year plan, et cetera, et cetera. So can you talk about how important it is for policymakers to look to what other people are doing and to figure out how to build progress instead of constantly reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, there's so much to learn. Like a lot of jurisdictions that have the very same problems, and we don't have to come up with our own solution every time. We really would be well served to build on what's already out there. A problem is there's not consistency in measuring that progress, so it's harder to tell what is successful and what isn't. But government, I really strongly believe that we have to get a lot better at where we spend those scarce government dollars. There's so much that could be done if there were funds available. You don't want to spend a nickel on something that's not working. And one of the other issues that we really tried to focus on was the a lot of organizations that deliver service are spend way too much time writing application grants, reporting back. And if what we wanted to do was kind of lump together funding within a neighborhood, for example, and say, okay, let's look at all of the programs in this neighborhood. Can we pool the money and just get one coordinated strategy? It gets tricky, right? Because every organization wants to protect those organizations. But at some point, I think you have to consolidate.
Well, and a lot of these problems are a bit of a Jenga situation where they just start to pile on top of each other and they're all pretty interrelated. So, when you were working in this space, one of the big issues that started coming up 10 years ago that has now exploded in the last few years is the issue of homelessness.
Yeah.
So I don't actually, despite working on this issue, I don't actually know how the expert advisory panel on homelessness came to be, but I know you worked on it with then Housing Minister Ted McMeekin. And the idea was, let's set an ambitious target and then figure out how to actually reach it. So the target was ending homelessness by 2025. Unfortunately, we are in 2025 and homelessness is not gone. It has exploded. But again, it went back to the idea of we know what we need to do to solve these problems. Let's just actually fund it and actually start working on it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that process was like and what inspired that.
I mean, so this was because we had every 5 years, you had to develop a new strategy with targets and metrics attached to it. So I can't remember if I got how I actually got it approved, but definitely ending homelessness was what I thought we needed, our next most urgent issue. And we had demonstrated with children that you can get results and celebrate those results. So ending homelessness was something, it's a no-brainer. Like, it's more expensive to support people who are unhoused than it is to house them. I had read an article called $Million Murray by Malcolm Gladwell.
Right.
I'm sure you read. Like, I kind of made
it's a famous one
because it made the argument so well that just kind of, we know what we need to do. Let's do it, and we will. It's supporting people in supportive housing is a fraction of the cost of keeping them in a hospital or in a jail cell, or supporting their health needs because they're not properly housed. So it's just like, let's just do this. So it was a wonderful experience, that expert panel. We began every meeting with people living in poverty with lived experience coming and talking to us about what the dominoes that fell to land them into being unhoused, how that worked and why that worked. And we met kids coming out of foster care. We met people, there were many, many different stories, all of which ended with people becoming homeless. And it was such a good education for us all. I tell you, the thing that I learned from that was that although the stories were very, very different, at the root was trauma for everyone. There was trauma was the trigger that got people into that position. So it was wonderful. We wrote a terrific strategy on how to end homelessness. The other thing about homelessness is that there aren't that many people who are affected by it, right? Like as a percentage of the population, it's a tiny
Right.
fraction. You can, people who work in these communities know people by name, like you know who they are.
Yeah. Well,
You know what
this was
they
part of the
need.
goal, right? The goal wasn't homelessness in general; it was chronic homelessness that it was
Yeah,
addressing,
which we defined
right?
as
Which,
6 months
yeah,
homeless. Yes.
yeah, and so that was the thing. It's people fall into homelessness, but generally for a little bit of time, unless they fall into chronic homelessness, and then it's very hard to get out. So to your point, it's not as many people as you would think, but it is really difficult to address at that point.
It's more difficult, but we again we know what works, not with everybody necessarily, but with
Hmm.
a lot of people. Housing first. It just drives me crazy when I heard Pierre Polyev
I know.
yesterday saying his response to encampments was to just mow them down. Like that really doesn't fix the problem.
Well,
It's
and it's interesting to me that we see this issue come, this idea of criminalizing poverty essentially come back up. Like this was something that you would have been around in those days. Jim Flaherty, when he ran for the leadership of the PCs in Ontario in 2002, he put forward this position: let's criminalize homelessness, let's put homeless people in jails. And I don't know why this idea won't die out, because it's very expensive. It doesn't actually work, but it keeps coming back up.
because it has some innate, like, yeah, just get rid of them. It's so stupid. It's just stupid.
So obviously we had set to work on that, but I think one of the, other than OSAP, because that was one of the last things that you had worked on, but prior to that, one of the last sort of income floor related issues you had worked on was, the inspiration behind Ontario's basic income pilot. So obviously some other ministers were the ones that ultimately released it, but that really had its genesis with you. And I've actually never asked where the idea came to you from, how it got going in the government. Because I arrived at the tail end part of it when we were starting to launch it and all that. But what was the genesis of this? Where did the idea come from?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I even remember. I know that there were people in the premier's office who were very supportive of it. The premier herself was very supportive of it. It 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 just made sense, and I don't remember. I wonder if Kathleen Wynne would remember. The frustrating thing with that, of course, was that the we put in a very robust um, uh, measuring. We really were. This was a pilot where we were really going to learn a lot,
Right.
and we spent a lot of time and money setting up the program, selecting the people to participate, all of that preliminary work. And we were just getting rolling with people actually understanding what a difference it would make in their lives when it was canceled. And it was such a waste of money to to get that far into it and not
Right.
finish the second year of the pilot. Um, anyway, that's, I guess, this damn thing called democracy, where you get to choose a new government every few years. But it would have been
Well,
worth.
I was going to say, we were just talking about the idea of criminalizing homelessness not dying, but basic income is an idea that doesn't die. So, of course, this has origins long before the pilot in Ontario. You can talk about
Yes.
Dauphin, Manitoba. Um, One of the New York mayoral candidates just yesterday announced that she wants to do a citywide basic income pilot for everyone who is unhoused in that city, which is an enormous number of people. So this is something that won't die. Even, the big tech bros who are not necessarily on side with democracy and other things
Yeah.
all the time are interested in this idea. It's been done in Finland. It's been done in Africa. Why do you think it is such a resilient idea? And, in this age of AI, do you think there is actually some appetite maybe to actually fully roll it out at some point?
I hadn't thought of the link between it and AI, but heck, AI can do a lot of things, I suppose. But I mean, I think it just makes sense. It just makes sense. There are so many different programs out there that support a floor, an income floor for some people some of the time, but it's messy and it's um, I think it's expensive to administer. Uh, Although I'd have an open mind on that, but it seems to me when you've got so many different programs for people, it's better to have one universal basic income that you
Well,
can
when I talk about basic income with people, I say like we already have a basic income for children. It is the CCB, the OCB. We have a basic income for seniors. So, just fill in the rest of it. It's like when we did OHIP Plus, right? Like just fill in the rest of it.
Yeah, and we have a basic income for people with disabilities.
Right?
Um,
That could be up, but yeah.
yes, yes. But it's all the other people who don't fit into any of those buckets.
Right.
Yeah. So it just,
So something I think about in terms of, society. I saw a meme today on the internet where people said, young people think university degrees are pointless now because AI is taking over the jobs. Like, what's the point? So it's not worth the, even when I was going to school, which was now 20 years ago, that was already a feeling that, you're going to get this education. That job may not exist by the time you graduate. And what is this paper really worth? So I do think about it in, those linkages between AI and just making sure there is a basic floor if there's not a job for everybody anymore based on skill set or geographic location or whatever it is. So given that, it seems to me like this would be a really great time to pursue it. We know at the federal level, there is a senator and an MP who have been pushing legislation in both houses, obviously died on the order paper as we went into this election, but it is something that has captured a lot of interest, especially across Canada.
yeah, I think, for all the reasons that it makes sense. I mean, there are people who say, well, if you pay people to stay home, then they'll stay home. And we know that's not true.
Exactly.
And the pilot would have demonstrated that.
So, we saw other provinces sort of follow Ontario into this path. PEI has been talking about it for a long time. My hope that depending on who wins the election, and this episode will come out after it's done, so the audience will know who won the election by then. But depending on who wins the election, Mark Carney has shown some interest in this space. I don't know if he would call it actual basic income or UBI or any of these names, but there's the principle is there. So perhaps it is an idea that just hasn't been born at the right time, but is still somewhere on the horizon. So, maybe we'll just close off by talking about what advocates can do to help ensure that these programs and ideas that create an economic floor actually make it through to the reality stage as opposed to just dying on the drawing board. What advice do you have for folks who want to advocate for income security and want to push issues, whether it's basic income or other programs like that? What advice do you have for them?
So this is political, and it is politicians who will decide whether or not to pursue a universal basic income. And so making sure politicians know that it's important to you is a really good motivator. So I would really urge people to advocate within their community and provincially or federally to know that the politicians know this issue matters. I can tell you, I ran, I think, in 4 elections, knocked on countless thousands of doors, and the issue of poverty reduction came up once or twice. Like, it was not an issue for the vast majority of people, even though church groups would come to me, faith-based groups would come, and it's a priority for them. Well, then mobilize, make sure the politicians know this matters, and then heck, run for office, right? Like it happened that we would not have an Ontario Child Benefit, and if it had not been for the women who were elected that election in 2003, it wouldn't be there. So I would say advocate like hell, make it an issue.
I think that's a great note to end off on, whether you get involved as a candidate or just in the background of politics, do something because these issues really matter.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining me, Deb.
Thanks. It's great to connect.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.